Well, I've been doing my videos a different way for the last few weeks, and I'm doing it the way today, kind of the way I used to do it. Only I've set up myself to do it at home. And this is a story that goes back a few years. This was a 2000 Cherokee that we worked on a couple of times. That's why I call it Double Tap. And we can look back sometimes, benefit from what we've learned previously. And I had this friend of mine that bought his 87 Camry way back in the day when it was brand new. When he had about 100,000 miles on it, him and his wife was telling me that it was not running right. It was cutting up and surging and all that. So I went by their house and I picked it up and I drove it to the Ford place, which is where I was working at the time. And whenever I got the timing cover off, I could tell that it had jumped 3 teeth on the timing chain. It's amazing to me that it got me to the Ford place all the way. I mean, I had to drive about 30 miles, and I could have been left beside the road. But anyway, I didn't have any books on this thing at the time. There was no all data back then, and we didn't have any, way to get to anybody. So whenever I got this thing taken apart, I got the timing cover off. See these 2 marks right here, and the timing mark on that I called the guy from the Toyota place, and the guy from the Toyota place said, well, there's a little mark, and he told me this. He said there's a little mark right here. That's when he told me. That's one of the 10 o'clock position on that cam cap, or cam bearing cap, where the seal is. And he told me to line it up there. I could have sworn that. I remembered that. He didn't, if he hadn't told me that. Anyway, on that 87 model, in my memory, I believed I remembered putting this thing on this mark, and the thing ran like a top. Now, I obviously remembered it wrong, or I accidentally put it on this mark, which that's the one it's supposed to be on, or something. But when we put this 89 model a few years after that on the wrong mark, it wouldn't even start. Fortunately, those engines don't bend valves, okay? So anyway, that's when I learned that right mark right there. Now this silly mark here, some of the people who are Toyota buffs might know what that mark is there for. I don't know, but the simple fact is it's not there for a timing mark. So my rear view mirror was wrong that day, but because the Toyota didn't bend valves, it wasn't a problem. Well, looking back is usually good because we learn the weak links in the ones that we work on. The weak links, being like your a lot of you guys have probably replaced these canister vent valves on Chevrolets. They die all the time on the truck. The fuel tank sending units on the Chevys. Ford DPFE sensors, I have a picture of one of those here. Clogged DGR ports, and this is a timing belt failure at about 108,000 miles. You're going to typically see a timing belt failure on a lot of these old Kia engines, that are in your little Korean-made cars. That snaps the head off the valve and beats the crud out of the piston. Basically, it's an engine replacement. O2 sensor heaters fail a lot. That seems to be the most failure-prone part of O2 sensors lately, at least the old kind of sensors. And then your sledged up Dodge V6s, and then your burned out fuse panels. There's a whole bunch of there's a bevy of other things that you can think of. It's the weak links in a chain. So when one of those comes in with that kind of problem, you're typically going to say, oh, I've seen a lot of these, I know what this is. But it can steer you wrong if you're not really careful. There are these times when looking back, I went through a spell where I saw fuel pumps dropping left and right. Now back in the mid 80s when they started putting a lot of electric fuel pumps in and running higher fuel pressure, before they started putting lubricant in the gasoline, they were putting olefins in there to keep the injectors clean. That's another story. But they put lubricants in the gasoline so the fuel pump wouldn't wear out. Well, when the fuel pump wore out, it would basically make a noisy pump and low pressure, cavitating, producing foam and all that. So I ran into this Taurus, and it looked like all the rest of them I'd seen. I checked it, and the pump wasn't, or inertia switch wasn't tripped, pump wasn't running. I dropped the tank and threw a pump at it. That wasn't what was wrong with it. Followed the yellow brick road. It turned out the ground there at the battery, it was all chalky and everything. Well, I went ahead and fixed that ground. Then I did some soul searching. Should I take the guy's old pump and put it back in there? Then I thought, no, I shouldn't do that because Those pumps are so failure prone, if it fails again, it's going to come back in on the hook, and I'll be fixing it for free. So I went ahead and left the pump in there, which probably protected him from a later failure, and replaced the chalky, or soldered those chalky wires, and it took care of that. Now, be careful not to do a repair without finding the root cause. Don't get caught up in the weak links trap, okay? Because sometimes the weak links, you need to verify whatever it is going on before you say, yeah, I know this, what that is, and throw a part on it and think you're going to put it out the door. Worst case scenario is if it does go out the door and comes back later, then they're not going to be happy. Be honest if you miss the root cause if it comes back. Now sometimes if it comes back you get all huffy and ticked off because you say, I know I fixed that car right, and then you find out it was your fault. You need to be honest with your customer if you do wind up in a situation like that. The Jeep had been purchased with 33,000 miles on it from a used car lot. After the first oil change, there was no oil pressure. What that typically means is it developed an oil pressure problem and somebody dumped a bunch of motor honey in it to increase the viscosity of the oil so they could drive it. It was bought at the sale by a used car dealer who sold it to this guy who was a soldier. And the tire shop that did the oil change, whenever it dropped away to get no pressure, he called me. So that after the first oil change, when they had driven it, he gave me a call. He said, hey, this Jeep's got no oil change. What do you think we ought to do? I said, drop the pan, drop the oil pump, pressure up the oil gallery with a rubber tip blower and see where the oil pressure is going, because it's fairly easy to see it on a straight 6, And so what did the guy do? He just pulled the oil pan off and put an oil pump on it. They didn't do any of this stuff. It would have been so easy for him to get his air hose and stick it up there, blow air up in the oil gallery. You can also take the oil pressure sending unit out. We did that on a 2005 F-150 that we suspected of low oil pressure that was causing timing chain issues, and we took the oil pressure sending unit out and put a hose up in there and put shop air pressure in there, and we were able to find out where the oil pressure was going on that one by listening down there. That's another story. Anyway, this wound up in one of our service bays because after they ran it for a while, even with the new oil pump, it was better, but it still didn't have good pressure. So we drained the oil pump, removed the pan oil pump, put the rubber tip blower on the pump feed, the air hissed out around the cam bearings, and to replace the cam bearings, the engine had to come out on that one because they were wiped out. That extra space in between the camshaft and the bearings was letting the oil get out of there. And the cam bearings and the lifters, by the way, are the last thing that typically sees any oil. They're the opposite end of the oil gallery from the oil pump. The crankshaft gets its oil first because it's really carrying the heaviest load. Well, the cam bearings are not all the same size on this engine. They kind of look like they are. They look like what these English people call serviette rings, which you basically put your napkin through whenever you're at the table here. But the long and the short of it is the oil pressure was perfect after we replaced the cam bearings, but the cam bearings in the back of this engine, there's only 4 cam bearings in this engine, but the cam bearings in the back are slightly smaller than the ones going forward. And whenever you're putting cam bearings on an engine, which is real aggravating if you don't have the tool, there's a special tool for driving them in there and all that. But you need to make sure that every single one of whenever Jeep produced those cam bearings and we were putting them in at the dealership, they would basically have color codes showing you which one went where. It's that important. And I've actually seen that on some other engines too, but I don't remember which ones they were, but on only Jeeps they're like that. But we had good oil pressure. Driving down the road, we had like 50 pounds and we had like 35 pounds idling it hot, with the right kind of oil in it and no motor honey, right? All right, so 53,000 miles later, the same Jeep comes back with a different problem. Intermittent misfire at road speed. Took a 30-minute test drive before we could duplicate it. The guy actually drove it 35 minutes that I had driving it around. He came back and he said, man, it ran great for a long time. Now it's running terrible. And at first it started bucking like it had a spark leaking past the boot, but the farther it ran, the worse it got. You could switch it off and restart it and it would run perfect. Now that's always a hint whenever you run into a situation like that. Okay, so this 4-liter had dropped 4 cylinders the first time I caught it doing this in a service bay. It makes you wonder how I could even run on 2 cylinders, But I had these misfire counts here that I was getting. And they were sort of all over the map, but 3 and 4 were misfiring the worst. Cylinder 1 had a few misfires. Cylinder 6 had a few misfires. There were some, but you notice that 1 and 6 are companions and 3 and 4 are companions. That means they're at the top at the same time on every stroke. One on compression, one on exhaust. Well, I started by disconnecting the injectors to determine which cylinders were silent after seeing this to make sure I got it right. Sometimes it would drop 2 and 5, those are companions. Sometimes it would drop 1 and 6. Okay, so I did use my cheap generic scan tool, the other one was out for repairs at the time, to squeeze a P0353 coil primary circuit code and a P1391 loss of cam or crank signal. The coil primary circuit code seemed like a big deal, so I decided to do something radical. I got an Explorer coil I had on hand, and I wired that Explorer coil up instead of the coil rail to fix that. Or actually not to fix it, but to check and see if a coil rail was what it needed. Well, it did exactly the same thing with that Explorer coil on it that it did with the regular coil rail. And I said, well, incidentally, remember this. You may have 2 different Jeeps with 2 different coil rails, but there's a year model break over there, and I'm not going to dig out which one it is. But if you ever are working on a Jeep and you just grab a coil rail from a junk engine and put on there, they're not all wired the same internally, and you may have one that'll kick back and not start and do all kinds of crazy stuff. So you got to make sure you got the right coil rail for a 4-liter Jeep engine if you got a coil rail equipped engine. All right, so I studied the scan tool, cam and crank counters, and I was saying, well, maybe I can see something here. You know, you ever get there, you're looking at the thing, and you just sort of get your head on there trying to figure it out. I didn't really see any obvious concern. Well, I knew this guy wouldn't mind, so when I wonder where I drove the Jeep, he just wanted it fixed. So I drove it like it was my own. Sometimes that's the best way to find it, because if you're not driving it trying to get it to act up, if you're just going to the grocery store or something, it may act up that way when it wouldn't act up any other way. You got to make sure the customer's okay with that, though, because some of them think you're running errands on their vehicle, particularly if you're working for another shop. All right. It ran great all the way to Hardee's. I let the Jeep hot soak while I ate the burger, and it ran almost all the way back to the college before it started cutting up. Well, I had pay dirt there. But I was looking at the data stream, and I noticed the cam sensor was erratic, and it was flatlined, and that kind of thing. And I was wondering if I had found me a smoking gun. You know, we're always looking for a smoking gun and a silver bullet, right? All right, so I had another cam sensor on hand at the shop, popped that one on there. Didn't change a doggone thing, so we forget about part swapping. All right, so was it a cam sensor issue? Well, I wanted to make sure that I knew I didn't have some kind of a wiring issue with that thing. So I found a nice square wave signal right there, and there's your little 4 peaks up there at the top. Signal was making a PCM, but PCM wasn't sending the counter information to the scan tool. That told me I had a scan tool anomaly going on. And sometimes your scan tool will have some kind of a silly disconnect in its software, so it's not reading right, and you cannot use that data to try to fix that vehicle in a situation like that. So I like there to be a go, no-go thing on that. Got to remember, scan tool data is just coming over 1 or 2 wires, and it's having to be interpolated and sorted out and put back on your screen. So it's like third-party information almost, and that's a little annoying. A little faster on CAN bus equipped vehicles, but anyway. It's time for me to leave for the week, so I plugged the Jeep's PCM into my Jeep. Just so happened I was driving a 2001 model yellow one at the time. About 10 miles into my journey home, I saw a flat cam sensor signal, but that didn't translate into any skipping. So I didn't duplicate what was being felt, I just duplicated what was being seen on the screen. That was what pointed me to the fact that it was a scan tool anomaly and not a PCM problem. By Monday afternoon, back at the shop, the red Jeep, when I was working on it, had deteriorated to the point the problem was almost always present even with the engine cold. It was getting worse. And that's not a bad thing when you're trying to find a problem. What is a bad thing is that when it gets better, right? And you still don't have it fixed. Or you don't know if it's fixed or not. So when idle was fine, as soon as the throttle was open, it would drop injector pulse to first one pair and then the others. It was really easy to duplicate. Well, that was interesting. It didn't always throw the cam crank code, but it virtually always threw ignition coil primary circuit codes every single time. Now, what was I supposed to think about that? Those codes are supposed to lead us in the direction we need to go, and sometimes they just don't, right? All right, so I also kept getting the transmission fault code. What the Sam Hill did that mean, you know? I wasn't getting that to start with. All right, so I knew the transmission circuit's being shorted sometimes. The reference voltage wire is the same one going to the speed sensor on the transmission as it is going to other places, the cam and crank. So I disconnected that wire harness, you know, make sure it wasn't shorted anywhere. I didn't see any problem change. It was doing the same thing. Worked on Explorer with odd misfires one time that wound up having a bad wire harness. So, considering these coil primary fault codes, I clipped the coil primary wires to the PCM and just ran a wire harness overlay, and I didn't accomplish anything. The problem was still there. Then there was the anomaly of these double coil current ramps. That was strange. You know, this one here wasn't really a multi-strike, but it was acting like it was trying to be, right? All right, now what are the coil primary wires? The coil primary wires are right here. They're the three little wires that trigger the high voltage spark, right? And that's the way it is, whether you're talking about a relay or an ignition coil. All right, so this is how it's wired. Just one of the three primaries is what we're looking at here. I put this schematic together here. There's a Zener diode in there with a resistor wired series to it, and whenever the primary spike happens, it basically looks for that going through this Zener diode. See, when the primary spike, a Zener diode, what a Zener diode does is it keeps voltage from going from one direction unless it goes above a certain voltage level, and then it lets it go both ways. So whenever the spike jumps like it does, you know, every time you release like if you think about when your point's open, your spark happens, this is basically the primary signal. The primary signal looks almost exactly like the secondary signal anyway and can be used for diagnosis. This particular one, that's when that spike happens, the microprocessor sees that, okay? And when it sees that, it knows that that primary was triggered. And when it doesn't see that, that's when it stores the codes. You get that? Secondary ignition oscope agreed with the Intero PDA. There were indeed 2 firing spikes per spark plug, but the second spike seemed to come and go, and when it did, the sound of the engine would change. This was related to concern, but what did it mean? Well, I got a phone call from Glenn Young, a friend of mine who lives down in Houston. I bought equipment from him, and I've taught some classes for him, and he's a really sharp cookie. And he offhandedly suggested checking the cam sync setting. Being an open-minded guy that I am, I jumped on that, right? So I pulled up the scope trace on the screen. The cam synchronizer housing should be rotated until the pattern looks like this. Notice where it is? Halfway between the sets of 4 from the crank sensor, right? All right, now let me show you what it looked like before and after we adjusted it on this one. That's what it looked like before we adjusted it. That's what it looked like after we adjusted it. And that's all that was wrong with that vehicle. There was nothing else wrong with it but that. Of course, we had to put all the other stuff back in. Now, you can check the sync on one of these even without an oscilloscope. And all you got to do is make sure you're on top dead center compression, put it on number 1, and then adjust your cam synchronizer. You got to turn, you loosen this up like you would a distributor, you turn it until you got this will go right through that hole in the outside of that housing and through there. When you got that set like that, matter of fact, they say to use a toothpick on that. But anyway, that's all that needed to be done. Now, in order to make sure you're on compression, you can either be on number 6 exhaust or on number 1 compression, because those are companions, because when number 6 is on exhaust, top dead center, number 1 is on compression. So how do you determine that? Well, if you've got your number 1 on top dead center, what I like to do is there's a little tool with a whistle on it, stuff like that. You can stuff a rag or a cork or something in there, bump, 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 bump. It pops the cork out, and you keep moving it very slowly until this perfectly lines up on where the number 1 is. And that's how you know you're in the spot you need to be to set that, right? All right, the concern was first difficult to duplicate. When we did duplicate it, the odd primary ignition codes in the companion cylinder drop led us astray. And after the fact, it's wise to remember how wacky the cam sensor can be. All right, Fords will throw a code and may have a slight roll in idle on units with adjustable cam sensors. A cam sensor on a Ford can be completely offline and throw a PO340 code, but it'll still start and run just fine. Some V6 Nissan, now like I say, if the Ford's out of adjustment, it may have a roll in idle, but it's not going to be acting really crazy and ugly. V6 Nissans might start hard if just one of the 2 cam sensors fail. I've seen that. Guy came in with a Nissan with a V6 in it and needed a starter. Well, the reason he needed a starter was because he had a bad cam sensor on one bank, and it was spinning and spinning and spinning and spinning every time he started it. After we put that cam, we found a code for a bad cam sensor, replaced the cam sensor, and he could just breathe on it and it would start up. 4-cylinder Nissan Altimas may or may not start with the cam sensor disconnected. You disconnect the cam sensor on one of those, may start, may not. I've actually seen a cam sensor that was giving me a bad scope pattern to make it look like it was out of time, but it turned out just a bad sensor. That's unusual because it doesn't even seem like it would be possible. Never assume a cam sensor failure will act the same on every vehicle. That's the point. All right, here's your test question. What's the most sensible next step when pursuing a verified low oil pressure concern and the crankcase has the right amount of oil? All right. That means you verified it has low oil pressure. You're not trusting the gauge on the dash, right? Test question number 2. Which wear-prone component on an engine receives unfiltered oil? All right. In a motor oil classified as CF4/SH, what does C stand for? Give you a little time here. You may be scribbling on a piece of paper now. Technician A says any oil filter that's the right size and has the same threads will always work. Does he know what he's talking about? Technician B says some engines can be destroyed by using the wrong oil filter even if it looks and fits the same. Think about that for a minute. Technician A says late ignition timing can cause a speed density fuel injection system to run rich and force the fuel trim readings to the negative. Technician B says an erroneously low baro reading indicating high altitude will drive fuel trim figures to the positive. Who's correct about that? Each of the following statements is true except A, the cam bearings on a late model Jeep 4-liter are all the same size. B, 10 psi per 1000 RPM is the minimum acceptable oil pressure. C, the crank receives oil pressure out so all leaves a filter. Or D, all engine oil pumps are positive displacement pumps. Technician A says a Miller special tool is needed to align the cam sensor synchronizer during assembly of a 4-liter Jeep engine. Technician B says the crank should be at 0 top dead center on the number 5 exhaust stroke before the cam sensor is set. Who's correct about that? Technician A says on a 4-liter Jeep engine, the cam sensor synchronizer is driven by the oil pump. Now this is the cam sensor synchronizer here. Technician B says the cam synchronizer drives the oil pump. Who's correct about that? Section 9, Technician A says the camshaft can be removed and reinstalled on a Jeep Cherokee 4-liter without removing the cylinder head, but only with the engine removed from the vehicle and mounted on an engine stand. Technician B says the oil pan needs to be removed in order to install the cam bearings. Who's correct about that? And finally, question 10. Technician A says some overhead valve engines have solid push rods. Now that's the ones that have the camshaft and the block, okay? Technician B says overhead cam engines usually have a pressurized oil gallery in the head that receives its feed through a port in the head gasket. Who is correct about that? All right, we're going to whip through these questions so you'll know what the answers were. Most sensible next step is to perform diagnostics and find the cause of low oil pressure. You know, if an engine's overheating, you don't jerk the cylinder head off before you check everything else, right? Wear-prone component, oil pump. Now, it's got a little screen, but it doesn't really have a filter, right? Okay, so you ever seen an oil pump that locked up because of some little sliver of plastic from the timing belt went in there, or the timing chain went in there? I've seen that a few times. You know. Yeah, so test question 3, basically the right answer to that is compression fired, as opposed to spark fired. Spark fired would be a gasoline engine. Technician A says any oil filter that's the right size and has the same threads will always work. He is wrong. You don't want to take that kind of a chance, especially not in today's world. Technician B says some engines can be destroyed by using the wrong oil filter, even if it looks and fits the same. The reason that is correct, particularly on these Jeeps, is because there was a breakover between like 97 and 99. I don't remember exactly where the rear, but it's right in there close there somewhere, where the oil filter, and I think it was on the earlier ones, the oil filter, the relief valve was built into the oil filter instead of being in the oil gallery somewhere like it usually is. The relief valve is basically what enables you to have pressure. Yeah, you got a positive displacement pump, but on the other hand, you have to have a relief valve before you're going to have any pressure. That's another lesson for another time. But the point is, somebody puts an oil filter that doesn't have the relief valve in it on one that requires the relief valve be in the oil filter, it will destroy the engine. Now, I've known of 2 engines that got destroyed by an oil change shop right after those Jeep that came out in the late 90s. Err on the side of caution, that's the point, right? Technician A says late ignition timing can cause a speed density fuel injection system to run rich and force the fuel trim readings to the negative. That's true too. The reason that's true is because a speed density system uses a map sensor to reads engine vacuum to determine engine load. What happens if you've got late ignition timing? You got late ignition timing, you basically have got low engine vacuum. If you got low engine vacuum, the engine controller interprets that as higher load. If you got one that the timing will adjust on that. Higher load means more fuel, and that's going to drive fuel trim reading negative. All right, technician B says an erroneously low barrel reading will drive fuel trim figures to the positive. Now the reason that happens is if you're at a higher altitude, you got less air pressure, you need less fuel. If it's fooled into thinking you're at higher altitude when you're actually at sea level, then you're going to get less fuel than you need. The oxygen sensor is going to pick up on that. It's going to crank the fuel trims up to balance things out. And so always look at that barrel reading. It's really important. I've seen people throw oxygen sensors on there when all they needed was a map sensor. But you can look at the barrel reading on your scan tool and tell. Anyway, both those guys are right. All right, the cam bearings on a late model 4-liter are all the same size. That is the only incorrect, because you remember I was talking about that, there's only incorrect statement on that whole thing. Technician A says a Miller special tools needed. He's wrong. Technician B says the crank should be at 0 on the number 5. Neither one of those guys are right, because I said exhaust 6, compression 1, because those are companions. They go up and down together, right? Technician A says the 4-liter Jeep engine, the cam sensor synchronizer is driven by the oil pump. Actually, this gear is driven by the camshaft, and this shaft, where it goes out, goes down to the oil pump. So technically, the synchronizer drives the oil pump. Technician A says the camshaft can be removed and reinstalled on a 4-liter without removing the cylinder head. That's wrong, because you got to pull the lifters out. You can't pull the camshaft out unless you pull the lifters out. All right, technician B, and you got to pull the head off to get the lifters out. On this engine, not on every engine, but on this engine you do. A lot of engines you do nowadays, though. Technician B says the oil pan needs to be removed in order to install the cam bearing. That is correct. You do, because you're going to have to be able to see. Right here is the tool when they're driving the cam bearings in, you know, and that's really important. And actually, that cam bearing has been driven out, is what it basically amounts to. So that's an old cam bearing that's been removed, and you start on the other side of that whenever you're putting it back in. Technician A says some overhead valve engines have solid push rods. They do, but when they do, they'll have an alternate way for oil to get to the rocker arms, right? Technician B says overhead cam engines usually have a pressurized oil gallery. They have to have a pressurized oil gallery in the cylinder going up to the cylinder head. That's an oil leak, potential oil leak point, so keep that in mind. Seen that before. So whenever that pressurized oil goes up to the cam bearings, you know, it actually has to have a seal around it, like that one out there. When that seal fails, you may have oil leaking out from under the cylinder head in great quantity, and that's something you probably would never see on one that had the camshaft in the block. All right. Also, the right thing to do when you're rebuilding an engine that's got hollow push rods is to replace all the push rods. They only cost a couple of bucks a piece anyway, because there's a lot of crud in those things you won't ever work out of there, and you don't want that bouncing around in your